Okay, so it's good to be here with you, Thomas Verny.
Thank you, Kate White.
It's good to have an interview with you since I don't think I've ever had one with just you
No, no, I don't
uh,
think we did. No.
and we have had a long association
Yes,
doing things together, but at APA, the Association for Pre and Perinatal Psychology and Health.
yes,
And we did the journal together for a little while,
yes,
and I worked for APA for 6 years, and so it was really good to have, you know, work with you and be able to support you. We did a lot of presentations. You asked me to help you with those at times, and that was
yes,
fun.
yes, that's right. And I have always admired and respected your contributions.
Yeah, thank you so much. But for the people who are coming to hear this interview or read, um, I would love to have them know you, Thomas. And mo many people do know you as the co-founder of APPA with David Chamberlain. But it was your first book that really put so many things on the map. And I'm wondering if you would like to tell people a little bit more about yourself, and maybe then we could go into talking about your work and your writing and the things that you've done to really change the world for mothers and babies and families with babies. So,
Hmm. Yeah, well, it's hard to know where to start. Of course, having worked on pre and perinatal psychology now for more than 40 years, um, my immediate impulse would be to start at preconception, but I think we would need more more than an hour to just get into that. So let's start with the fact that when I was a young psychiatrist about 45 years ago, one of my I was doing psychotherapy. I was having a psychotherapy session with a young man, and in the midst of the session, suddenly he started crying like a little baby. And he continued like that. I did not interrupt him. I did not ask him any questions. So he cried for about 10 minutes. Then he came out of it, so to speak. And I asked him what happened. And he said he had just found himself as a baby in a little crib crying for his mother. And then he said, being a somewhat skeptical young lawyer, he said, there's something wrong with this picture because I've actually seen photographs of myself in a crib. And the crib that I've just found myself in right now was white. And the photographs that I've seen were always taken in a blue crib. So doesn't quite make sense. So I suggested that he go home, speak to his mother. Of course, he was a young man, his parents were still alive. And he came back the following week for his regular session. And he said, this is amazing. But it seems that the first couple of months of my life after I was born, my parents did not have enough money to buy me a crib. And they borrowed a crib from a neighbor. And that crib was white. And only 2 months later, just like your name, and two months later, they bought me my very own crib. That was blue, and that's the one that all the pictures were taken in. So that gave me kind of pause, but I was very well educated, quote unquote. I went to University of Toronto, I went to Harvard, and we were always taught that children before the age of 2 or 3 don't remember anything. So this is impossible. This could not happen. But then, as time went on, over the next few months, as I became sort of a little bit more aware of the possibility of this thing, I heard more and more similar stories from other people. Uh, there was an interview, for example, on the radio with a very, very famous conductor in Canada. And he was asked at the end of the interview, I guess they ran out of regular questions. He was asked, well, Boris, his name was Boris Pratt, um, where do you think your musical career started? And he immediately answered without thinking, it started in my mother's womb. So everybody, of course, was incredibly astonished. This is like, 45 years ago. And they said, what do you mean? And he said, well, he was studying to be a conductor. And there were sometimes, he said, even before he turned the page, the cello lines would sort of jump out at him. Like he sort of intuitively knew, without ever having studied that particular score, what the next few notes would be. And so he went home to his mother, just like in my first case here, and he told her about that. And she said, well, what are the pieces that seem so familiar to you? And he told her which piece seemed particularly familiar. And she said, that's the one that I was practicing when I was pregnant with you. So when a few cases like that, a few stories like that came together, I began to wonder, began to question whether sort of the accepted wisdom of the ages, that children before the age of 2 or 3 could not remember anything, was incorrect. And so then I told an obstetrician, a very well-known obstetrician in Canada, about some of these experiences. He shook his head, of course,
Of course.
and he said, well, next summer in Rome, there is an international conference on psychosomatic obstetrics and gynecology. And that meeting takes place every 4 years. It's a huge meeting. And Ronnie Lang is going to be there, famous Scottish psychiatrist. Many, many very, very famous, well-known people, like anybody who was anybody was going to be there, except me, who was nobody.
Yeah.
I was very young. I had by that time written one book on group therapy, but apart from that, I was unknown. Uh, so I submitted a paper what was it called? It was called some it it was I'm trying to remember what it was called. It wasn't called The Secret Life. It was called, oh, something Life of the Unborn Child. What was it? It was kind of, oh, The Psychic. Yes. It was called The Psychic Life of the Unborn Child. And to my absolute surprise, not only was it accepted, because like I said, I was, a no name. Not only was it accepted, but it was put on the main program in the morning with all the big names, including Ronnie Lang. Um, so I had 20 minutes and I presented my paper. And towards the end, I could see there were about 500, 600 people in the audience. I could see that everybody was really excited. It was palpable. You could feel the excitement, the energy in the room. And so I said, well, today at 5 o'clock, when all these lectures are over, if anybody wants to come and talk to me more about this, please come to my room. I told them what room I was in. Well, 5 o'clock came, and there was this long lineup of people trying to get into my room.
Wow.
Yeah, wow, exactly. So I got to know some of these very important people. Um, after the meeting, I wrote down their names, and when I came back home to Toronto, uh, I started corresponding with them, continuing our conversation, and I could see from their responses and from some of the evidence that I was and studies and research that I was collecting from these people that there was a book in this. So that's when I decided to write The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. And that, of course, was picked up in New York. And there were 15 publishers who wanted to publish it.
Wow. That's a
Yeah,
great story.
it was Kate, it was absolutely amazing. I went to New York. Every hour on the hour, I had an appointment with a different publisher.
Wow, that's so
I,
exciting. Oh my gosh.
I
That,
would jump into a cab, go to the next publisher, go to the washroom, wash my face, try to refresh myself, go in, and essentially what they were interested in, could I talk like I'm talking to you? Could I talk sort of freely on television? Because at that time television was really big. So as long as I could put two words together and make some sense, they liked it. And I guess they liked my beard and my accent, like it was a typical psychiatrist here. So,
I guess you needed maybe a pipe. I don't know,
yeah,
a
but I had a
plaid.
pipe. I had a
Oh,
pipe.
you
I
had a
had a
pipe.
pipe. I had
Oh,
a pipe. I had a pipe. Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
good.
Yeah. So anyway, and then they started bidding on the book, and I must say that was one of the most exciting periods of my life. I would be in my office in Toronto, and my agent, I had a just a beginning agent who has never sold anything because, like I said, I did not have a name, and it was difficult to get an agent, but I got this agent, and she was really good. And she would call me, every 2 or 3 hours. We have we $10,000 from this and this publisher. Now we have $12,000 from that publisher. Should we accept? And so it went. So anyway, it got published. And that's how I got to know David Chamberlain, whose name you mentioned. Wonderful, wonderful man. And then once the book got published, as a result of it, I got to know so many people. People started writing me. So I said to David, we should really, present this at the American Psychological Association, these ideas. And he said, fine. And he, being a psychologist, he submitted an abstract for the paper. And of course, it was rejected.
Yeah.
And so I said to David, in a moment of, I don't know, not thinking but not thinking, why don't we form our own association? And he said, okay. And so we did.
And so you did.
So we did, just the two of us, no computers, no money, no association, no support from anybody. So me and my secretary that I had in my office, and then I gathered a number of people around me, including my wife and some other people, and we started planning on a big meeting in Toronto. And so we invited everybody. I advertised in local newspapers, etc., etc. And again, one of uh, the night before the opening of the Congress in Toronto, we had about 100 people registered. And I was sick to my stomach thinking that, that we would only have 100 people because like the expenses, were huge.
Right.
And 100 people would not cover it. And I was paying for it all from my own pocket because
Ah,
there was no association, right?
right.
So it was just me, financing the whole thing. And then I went to the University of Toronto where the meeting was to take place, and I saw this long lineup of people trying to buy tickets to get in, and we ended up with something like 500 people.
What a great story.
Yeah, so that was the beginning.
Yeah, I love this. I love hearing the beginning and The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. I mean, this book, I mean, when I created the education department at APA,
Yes,
what that was in 2013. Your
yes,
book was published in 1983, right?
right, correct, yes.
It was still current.
Oh, it's still selling. Like I just told you before we started, that it has just been published now in Slovak and Czech.
Yeah,
And
no.
and I think this year it was going to be published in Russia, and there are all kinds of places. So far, it has been published in 35 countries.
Yes. This is this book, and then you've written others. You wrote
Yes,
wrote the prenatal. this is a prenatal communication book, if I remember correctly, prenatal parenting.
Unbonded.
Um,
Yeah, 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 yeah. Prenatal parenting. Yes, I've altogether, well, this last one I published 2 years ago, The Embodied Mind,
mhm.
and altogether I've published 8 books.
Yeah, this is wonderful. I mean, you love to write, and
I love to write.
yes, and you have many presentations. I mean, your presentations are well known for how well documented they are and how you are about the science of it all. I mean, and that's one of the things I loved about Appa and you and David Chamberlain. I mean, David was also really great at footnoting, and I would go through to make sure because I
Yeah.
also just love that. And
Yeah.
but your work, I mean, it's still current, still
Yeah,
applicable. If anybody really wants to
that's
read
right.
something, it's The Secret
The-
Life of the Unborn Child is so
yeah.
easy.
Well, it's very easy to read, and that is the thing that people really like about my writing, that it is very accessible. Like
Yes.
I always put myself into the position of the reader rather than the writer. And I ask myself, is this clear? Can a person who does not have a university education, let's say, who's not an academic, can they still understand this? And I also like to bring like a lot of case material
Yes.
stories into it to make it come alive.
Yes. I mean, I've read everything that you've written, at least that I know of, even some of the chapters in some of these textbooks and all
Yes.
the things
Yeah.
that you write. And I attend when I'm in the
Seminars.
conferences, I
Yeah.
attend your
Hmm.
talks. I mean,
Yeah.
and you have wonderful materials always, and you're a very popular speaker. So it's wonderful. When I was with you in India, it was fun
Yes.
to watch you be so honored
Yes.
at the Manashakti.
Yes. They've invited me again for next year, but I just can't make it. It's just a little bit too stressful to travel that far and to be exposed to the heat and
Yes,
the different food. And I mean, last time already when I was, what was that, about 3 or 4 years ago when we were there?
yes,
I found it difficult, and the number of people and everything. So I'm going to be videotaping a presentation on trauma and stress, and they will show it as a part of a video presentation there.
nice.
Yeah.
Well, so for those people who are reading this interview or listening,
Hmm. Hmm.
who are not in pre-perinatal psychology,
Right.
um, I mean, what we know is that the baby receives information, and that
Right.
has a way that it comes in, whether it's through like the cello, like you're saying, the music,
Yes.
or
Right.
that memories can be generated from their time in utero during birth and after birth, and that these memories have lifelong implications into how we develop. And my goodness, the science has come along
Yes.
so wonderfully
Yes.
to
Yeah.
support all these things,
Yes.
and that the field is really changing and accepting. Like I remember one of my favorite quotes of yours, Thomas, is they used to throw pies at me, and now they serve me pie.
Yes. Did I say that? That's good. I like
Yeah,
that.
you did
I
say
like
that. Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. You said, yeah, I used to
Yeah.
duck pies, and now
Yes.
they serve me pie.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so our
It's
time really
true.
has come for those of us who
Yeah.
love this field the way we do.
Yes.
It is come of age,
Yes.
and so I'm wondering for those body psychotherapists that are out there that are curious about like the implications, like
Yes.
in your opinion, are we talking about early memories, and how would you summarize, if you could? I know you probably have a lot of information that you could say, but for the body psychotherapist out there, like how would you summarize the implications for the baby's experience?
Well, I think that um, what we need to, I think my answer is sort of layered, because there are sort of several answers to that question depending on which lens you are using in terms of looking at that particular question. So if you are looking at it sort of psychologically, sort of what people remember consciously, or what they can get in touch with unconsciously, then of course the important thing is that everything that the child experiences um, probably probably from the end of the second trimester on. And I will go back to that in a second. But at this moment, looking at it from a psychological point of view, um, everything that happens to a child from the end of the second trimester is remembered. It's inscribed in their memory banks. And just because they can't remember it doesn't mean that it didn't happen, and it doesn't mean that it does not exert a certain gravitational pull on everything that they do for the rest of their lives. So this is what we have to keep in mind, that just because you can ask a child, what do you remember about your birth, and they say nothing, doesn't mean that they don't remember it on some other level.
Right.
And in fact, we know that they can remember that in many different ways. For example, perfectly without any drugs, without any hypnosis. There have been many, many instances where mothers have reported that when they bathe their 2.5, 3.5-year-old child, and the child is relaxed, and it's relaxing in nice warm water, and the mother says, "What do you remember about your birth?" without putting too much pressure into her words, suddenly there is this whole flow of information that comes out. And they will say things like, "What was it like when you were born?" "It was cold." All right.
Yeah.
It was cold. Or I could move. Suddenly I could move. I was no longer, somehow bound in something. Stuff like that. They will tell you. So
Yes.
so obviously these children uh, know what happened to them. Um, but so what does that mean in terms of body therapy? Well, what it means is that the mode of birth, for example, is very, very important in terms of leaving behind what one might call sort of psychosomatic imprints. Because if, for example, a child is born naturally, without drugs, without forceps, just natural childbirth, that child is going to through the birth canal. It will get the best massage that he or she will ever get. It will come out on its own and feel on some level that he or she is a very competent human being. Like, I could do this on my own. I am terrific. This is a great world. I like it.
Mm.
It's a whole different attitude towards life, and a whole different attitude towards your body, because as you're going through the birth canal, every part of your skin is actually being massaged and being touched, so that you are very much in touch with what's happening to your body. On the other hand, if you compare that, let's say, to a forceps delivery, which I did, unfortunately, because I was studying and spent time on the obstetrical ward of a general hospital. I delivered 27 children. I think every one of them with forceps. And when you deliver a child with forceps, you put incredible amount of pressure on their head. And so children like that, when they are under stress, will develop pain in their neck and shoulder region. But they will also have this feeling that I can't do this on my own. Okay, like I need help. That kind of message is even more pronounced when someone is born cesarean section, because in cesarean sections, one of the very important things that happens is that the child does not pick up lactobacilli, which are in the maternal vagina. And so it does not pick up lactobacilli, and he or she will have trouble digesting maternal milk because that child needs the lactobacilli. Also, very often what happens in cesarean sections is that the child goes down the birth canal and gets stuck.
Yes.
And for that reason, then the obstetrician gynecologist will then do a C-section. So that child has a very different experience, a very different memories about being stuck and not being able to make it on their own. And so they will carry that in their bodies and in their minds. It's all together.
Right.
So one of the things that always bothered me after writing The Secret Life of the Unborn Child and going around the world talking about it like I'm doing with you was the fact that I met people who could remember things before the second trimester. I mean, all the way back to conception.
Wow.
All the way back to conception. I had a patient. I had a patient. So help me God. This is the truth. I had a patient who, in one of his sessions, went back to conception, and he could feel his mother not wanting to have anything to do with his father at that point, but father was trying to have sexual relations with the mother. Father was drunk.
Mm.
One moment, this man, he was in his 50s, this man could feel the mother's sort of thoughts and feelings of rejection of the father. I don't want to have anything to do with this man. And next moment, he could feel sort of the violence of the father who just wanted to sort of have his way. And the psychological problem that brought this man to me for therapy was that he was so ambivalent. Everything was ambivalence. He couldn't make up his mind, left or right, you know? And so having this experience, having this primal experience of conception really helped him to understand his ambivalence because he could feel the ambivalence of his mother and how it affected the rest of his life.
Right.
So one of the things that always bothered me were stories like that, because when I wrote The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, and for many years after, I had absolutely no doubt that the science was there to support the fact that a child after 6 months after conception had the biological substrate for laying down memories, primitive memories of feelings and thoughts, but memories. And, you know, there's research for that. But what about before 6 months? How come that children whose obviously central nervous system was not developed enough to lay down memories, how could they possibly remember things? And so I was in this doubt state until about 10 years ago, I came across in one of the medical journals, actually it was in the Lancet, which is like, there are only two Bibles for medical doctors in terms of journals. There's the Lancet and there's the New England Journal of Medicine. And anything that's written in that, that's the word of God. So, so in this Lancet in 2007, there was, but I only read it 10 years ago. There was this paper by a French doctor by the name of Lionel Fullet, and he described a man, a Frenchman, 44-year-old Frenchman, who came to see him because of a weakness in his left leg. And so they did all kinds of lab tests. They also did a skull X-ray. And to everybody's astonishment, this man had virtually no brain. Where the brain was supposed to be, there was only water, cerebrospinal fluid. He
Yes.
had a thin crescent of brain tissue, and that's it. No cerebral cortex either side. Yet this man was employed in the French civil service, whatever that says about the French civil service, but he was employed in the French civil service, probably not any better or worse than other civil servants. I hope you're not going to get nasty letters from civil servants. So he was gainfully employed. He was the father of two children, and he scored a 75 on an IQ test, which is, below average, but still
For no
fun.
brain, I mean, that's amazing.
Well, exactly. And so I thought to myself, how is this possible? How is it possible that a man without a brain could still function fairly well? I mean, he was gainfully employed. He was married. He had two children. He was well dressed. He went to the doctor on his own. How is this possible? So that's when I sort of started sort of doing research on people who perhaps were missing a brain as a result of accidents, or perhaps as a result, like people who have epilepsy sometimes, very, very bad cases of epilepsy. Both children and adults sometimes have part of their brains removed. So I started to doing more and more research, and I came to the conclusion, and we can talk about this a little bit later. I came to the conclusion that the only way to explain how this man functions was to um, was to accept the fact that there's some kind of a backup system to his brain. And the backup system, well, it has to be below the neck. It has to be the rest of the body. So that's when I started looking into cellular consciousness and cellular memory and what cells in our bodies can do.
Yes.
And very, very simply, I'm going to stop, don't worry. I'm, very, very simply, what I came up with, the conclusions that I came to was that all the cells in the body form a network. All the cells, tissues, organs form a network, just like the internet. And when they work together, they are able to have a mind and a brain, so to speak, which supports the main brain in the skull. So instead of having an enskulled mind, I've come to the conclusion that we have an embodied mind, that the whole body, the brain, neck, heart, whatever, all the rest really have to work together in order to have a well-functioning human being.
Yes. Yeah, well, I really loved reading that in your book, and you actually you shared with me before this was published your article about how memory happens. I know
Yes.
that maybe that was not finally
Yeah.
the way you had shared it with me, and I
Mhm.
did I did make it a part of the education department at APA and have very simply chunked it down so that people can get a sense of
Yes.
this your theory of this holistic body mind memory,
Right.
and that we have all this anatomy, but we also have this vibrating network of
Hmm.
cells and cellular memory.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so that's part of your book, and I also just love how you do all the research of the sea snail and the other really award-winning research that has fed into how the notion that we do remember, our memories are in our body. It's not just in our cortex and all the anatomy of our brain.
And
Um,
exactly. And that's why body therapists, can be so successful because memories are also in our bodies.
yes. And you had stated in the book that, and also in the chapter that you gave to me, that memories are in the nucleus of neurons.
Hmm.
I'm wondering if you would like to explain that a little bit more for people, just basically.
Well, they are in the nucleus, but they may be in other parts of the cell, also in its skin, the outside of the cell. Structures in the cell may contain memories. Like there are different hypotheses in terms of where memory could be. The cellular membrane is definitely one that our friend Lipson, the one who has written about genetics, Bruce Lipton. Bruce Lipton.
Bruce Lipton, yes.
Yeah,
He writes
sorry.
about that too.
He writes a lot about that. He writes about the cell membrane being sort of the brains of the cell,
Oh,
and I think that's one way of looking at it. But I think that that's just one part of the brain of the cell. And then there are other structures in the cell itself and the nucleus. And the nucleus, of course, contains DNA. And so DNA in every cell, has got the blueprint for what that particular cell is supposed to do. And that's incredibly, incredibly complex. And yet, a cell is so small that you cannot see it with the naked eye.
yes.
On the other hand, and in our culture, we sort of admire things that are large and kind of deprecate things that are small. And yet, cells are incredibly small, but they are incredibly complex little machines.
Yeah.
And so when you study cells, it's really like a whole new world that opens up to you. And the cells have little organelles, I think about 33 little organelles, which are tiny, tiny replicas of the organs that we have in our bodies. Like, for example, we have lungs, and the cells have something that's called mitochondria.
Mhm.
And so the mitochondria in the cell are sort of in charge of energy and providing energy for all the work that the cell has to do. And the work that the cell has to do is produce proteins. And so it's just incredibly complicated, and there's absolutely no reason why cells could not contain other memories. And one of the best examples of that, of course, are heart transplants, where people, without going into detail, because I know you want to cover some other questions, but very often what has been described in the literature is the fact that recipients of heart transplants often will change their personalities and assume the personalities of the donors. And there's I have some very good descriptions of that in my book. And there's much more, of course, in the literature. And the only way to explain that is that it's the transfer of cells which transferred also memories from the donor to the recipient. There's no other explanation.
Right. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know that we reproduce our cells die off and we reproduce them.
Yes.
I mean, we
Yes.
replace them. And I,
Yes.
I can't remember if it's every 3 months or every 9 months or something
Yeah. Something
sometime.
like different
Um,
different parts of the body have different sort of they run on a different clock. But brain cells, for example, reproduce I think reinvent themselves less often than cells in the gut. But there are some differences between different tissues, but they all renew themselves. Yeah.
yeah. So the memories though are retained, even
But
though
the memories are retained. Exactly. How does that
how
happen?
does that happen?
I have I have no idea. I really don't know. I mean, there are still a lot of unanswered questions,
Yes,
and I think that we are just probably scratching the surface.
I
Uh,
agree.
there's so much interesting new research coming out, but the problem is that very few people really are aware of this new research. So, there might be um, there was, for example, research from, I will tell you, um, this is so interesting. There's, for example, yeah, here it is. I have it. I have to refresh my memory. But DNA now can be found now in thin air, uh, and tiny fragments of DNA from people who have, let's say, walked through a forest. Uh, they can find that now. people who have been long deceased. Okay. Here's an article which I have, and this is so amazing. Uh, New DNA collecting techniques like catnip for law enforcement officials, says Erin Murphy, a law professor at the New York University School of Law, who specializes in the use of new technologies. The police specializes in the use of new technologies in the criminal legal system. The police have been quick to embrace unproven tools like using DNA to create probability-based sketches of suspects. But what is really important is that technological advancement allows more information to be gathered from even smaller DNA samples. And these DNA samples have been collected like in meadows, in forests, of people who have gone through it, may long be deceased, but some of their DNA has stuck to the leaves and the fibers in the forest and stuff like that. So the results of this research, just to give you an idea, published Monday in the journal Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. Now, how many neurologists read that kind of stuff? Hardly anybody. Demonstrate that scientists can recover medical and ancestry information from minute fragments of human DNA lingering in the environment. Now, isn't that amazing?
Yes.
It,
No,
it,
the
it, it
the
is totally
science,
amazing.
yeah. No, the
Yeah.
science is amazing, and we know so much more now about how we come into form, how our
Mhm.
environments inform our bodies as we make them in utero, and the transgenerational, intergenerational inheritances that we
Right.
have, and
Yes.
how we are born matters, and how we're received afterward, all those things.
Exactly.
So
All
it's
those things.
all that's important, and
Yep.
that now the early roots of health and disease, if you want to use
Yes.
that word,
Yes. Sure. Sure.
are all here. And though for those body psychotherapists that are out there, or anybody really,
Yes. Anybody really.
they can take a birth history and get a better sense of who is sitting in front of you. And
Yes.
I've been able to network with brain researchers now. Fetal brain is one of my big passions, and the placenta things. And
Hmm.
they
Hmm.
are predicting that the future of prenatal care will be these being able to understand the genetics and
Yes.
how sensitive they may or may not be to certain chemicals and approaches um, for the early period and what parents can expect. So it's the research, and also I try to stay up with the brain research and
Mhm.
understanding the neuroplasticity and healing and how that happens and how to be helping people that have these early traumas. I mean, we're getting much more sophisticated about that.
By the
Um,
way, I hate the expression neuroplasticity.
you do. Tell
I
me
do.
why. Tell me why.
Well, just for a second, think of plastics. I
Yeah,
mean,
they're
you
hard.
know, they're hard. They do not change. Uh, Here I have plastic.
Hmm.
This is all it can do. Okay. Now think of a cell, think of a neuron. I mean, it can do
A lot.
1,000 different things.
It's
It's
true.
not plastic. It has an incredible potential for change. It's
Right.
not plastic. It's the last thing that it is. It seems that a long time ago, I don't know who came up with it, but someone came out with this nice little word, neuroplasticity, and everybody has since that time accepted that without questioning. And it's nonsensical. It is the wrong word. It it's so wrong because it does not tell you anything about this huge potential, this huge intelligence, so to speak, of
Yes.
cells, right?
Yes. Yes. I so
Like this
so
is this is dead. This is not living. This cannot change. This cannot think. It's plastic.
let's call it neurofluidity.
Yes,
There you go. A new word that we actually coined here
yes.
on this day,
On this day, yes.
June 3rd, 2024.
Yes, neurofluidity, absolutely. Neuropotential,
Yeah.
all those things. That's right.
Neuropotential. Well, that's a
Yeah,
good word too.
yeah.
Well, let's complete our interview by
Okay.
talking more about your book, Thomas, because I feel like, I mean, it's wonderful for those of you who are out there that need data, that need science, that need a place to stand when you're working with systems or organizations or even your own clients. But I particularly would like to talk about consciousness, and I know that you told me that that chapter that you wrote on quantum mechanics or quantum, so, biology was really a challenge for you. But I read it, and I feel like when I am teaching, and what I try to present to my students who are learning how to work with birth trauma, because that's what I do mostly now, is to help them understand. I talk about the vibrating network and how there's memories here, but we're also like consciousness. And when you tell stories about how people can remember their births or remember their conceptions, consciousness, how we come into form and who are we in our bodies, and how can we start to document that, and how can we talk about that in scientific and medical settings? But it's much more esoteric.
Yes. Yes,
So
it
I
is.
would love to hear what you think about this consciousness in the
Yeah.
body.
Well, one of the main things that I concluded was that just like I'm opposed to, the expression neuroplasticity, uh, neurologists and people dealing, philosophers, whatever, who are dealing with consciousness have consciousness and the mind. I mean, the two are often equated, um, and they see the mind and consciousness as epiphenomena. In other words, that's a big word for function. So the mind and consciousness are a function of the brain. Just like urine is a function of the kidneys, the mind, consciousness is a function of the brain. Now, again, all you have to do is pause and think about that, and it doesn't make sense. Surely, mind and consciousness cannot be equated with urine.
Right.
Urine you can see, smell, you can do experiments with it. You can find out, what the contents are, what kind of chemicals there are, bacteria, whatever. You cannot do any of that with the mind or consciousness. Okay. These are like abstractions. Uh, so to say that the mind is a function of the brain does not make any sense. So I see the mind and consciousness, and we'll come to a differentiation between the two, again, as being the result of every cell in your body, including the brain, but not just the brain, working together to provide us with what we call mind and consciousness. Consciousness is a little bit easier to define than mind. Consciousness simply means that we know who we are at this moment. I mean, I think that's probably the simplest way. Okay. I know I'm sitting here at the desk talking to you, all that. I am conscious. Fine. Good. When we are anesthetized, for example, we are unconscious. But it doesn't mean that we are mindless because our mind is still working. So if someone, for example, says, oops, I think I just cut her arterial, I don't know, whatever. I've just cut her main artery in the neck. The guy is, or the person who is under anesthetic, his blood pressure is going to go through the roof because although he may be unconscious, his mind is still vigilant, still paying attention. So um, I think that the mind never sleeps. And the mind is a product of every cell in our bodies. And, I wrestled with this for months and I read hundreds of articles and books on this. And there are just so many different opinions about the mind and consciousness. What seems to be very popular now is is the fact that consciousness is seen like gravity. It's like one of the main contents of our universe. Like it's it's like it's like an energy field that is out there, and we have a little part of it. I don't know about that. Um, I am not a religious person. If you are religious, it's easy to say that God gives us consciousness. Um, I don't know. Um, maybe, maybe not. So I see consciousness and the mind being connected and a product, an outcome of all the cells in our bodies working together and giving us this sense of being who we are. Now, the other thing that I wrestled with in that chapter, and that's part of the problem, is free will.
Yes, I remember.
And so, if you are a materialist and if you are a true scientist in the 21st century sort of mode of being scientific, then you really have to believe that everything is caused by something else. Like, nothing happens on its own, nothing happens by chance. Um, if I knew all the factors that went into my conception, that went into my 9 months of pregnancy, etc., I could predict with absolute certainty what I am going to do in the next moment. In other words, there's no free will, really. In a materialist universe, there is no free will. Everything is predetermined by what happened before. And if we knew it, which of course is impossible, but if we knew all the factors that went into my being and every person that I've ever encountered and everything that I ever read, etc., 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 we could predict what I'm going to say in the next moment.
Right.
Okay. Um, so that is that is the view of the materialist science. So that's where I brought in quantum mechanics and quantum physics, because in quantum mechanics and quantum physics, there is a factor of unpredictability. Although it is science, the only thing we can do is talk about probabilities instead of certainties.
Right.
And the other thing that's very, very interesting about quantum science is that when you have two particles which at one time were connected and somehow got disconnected, it's called superimposition. When you have two such particles, they could be thousands of miles apart, but if one of them, let's say, turns one way, the other one will instantly turns the opposite way. Whatever happens to one will affect the other much faster than the speed of light, which according to Einstein, and since that time it has been universally accepted as scientific truth, it cannot happen. So once again, we are confronted by something that science says it cannot happen, but it is happening.
Yeah.
It's there. It has been measured. This is not up for debate. It has been measured. This is not somebody's crazy idea, certainly not mine. It has been measured, and it cannot be explained. There's no good explanation for it. So I think that when we look at quantum mechanics, which explain very well things that happen on a microscopic level, on a small and very, very small level. So it seems that sort of the physics of Einstein and all the other sort of regular mathematicians and scientists uh, work very well on the macroscopic level, on the large level. On a microscopic level, quantum physics works very well. And since we are dealing with cells, which are on a microscopic level, it seems to make sense to posit the fact that they may be following more quantum mechanics rules rather than the physicality rules of materialism. So I think that that's somehow where the mind, consciousness, and free will come in, is on a cellular level. And so that's how I see it.
Yeah. Thank you, Thomas. I feel like what I because I do read the science also, and I do love the medical world, and
Yes, yes,
and
yes,
they've gotten so much more detailed and
yes,
granulated about how we understand the body.
yes, yes,
The I What they say consistently is their mysteries are still afoot.
yes, yes.
There's not, we try so hard to define all these things in our human
Hmm.
world,
Hmm.
and yet mysteries are still here. And that's
Yes.
part of the joy of being human, so we can trust into some greater mystery. Like John Chitty, one of my teachers, would say,
Yeah.
greater forces are at work here.
Yes.
And
Yes. Yeah.
so we are these conscious beings. Our consciousness is in our
Yes.
bodies. And
Yes.
that if you can bring someone to be more conscious about their patterns and about their
Mhm.
lives, then they can be more intentional and have more happiness is what we all want.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And more in control of their lives, right?
Yes, not so much at the whim of these early memories or
Exactly.
even our lifelong challenges, just to
Yeah.
bring more
And
consciousness.
the traumas and
Yeah,
stresses that we have all suffered, not through any failures on our parts,
right,
not our fault,
right.
but it's life, right?
It is life. Well, just before we complete here,
Hmm.
Thomas, I'd like to ask if you could see the future, if you could, for pre-perinatal work and understanding the therapeutic world, if there could be like, how do you see the future for our field of practice and also for humanity?
Well, um, it's hard to be positive at this moment in time when there is so much trauma all around us in the world, right?
Right,
I
yes,
mean, everywhere you look, there's suffering, people are dying in every corner of the world, and even here in North America, which is, one of the richest places in the world, there are homeless people on the street, their children dying of hunger and malnutrition. Uh, we are going through some pretty difficult times, but it seems to me that the world has done this before. There seems to be some kind of a repetition of patterns where there is, for a while, there's contraction, like the Dark Ages, and then comes the Renaissance, and everything comes to light and to life. And then again, there is a withdrawal. So there is kind of a sinus wave, up and down, up and down. I think we are in a downward spiral right now. But hopefully, we can come out of it. And one way that we could, we have a chance of coming out of it is by making sure that our children are conceived in love and that they are carried for 9 months in the body of a loving mother, and that they are born into the hands and arms of loving parents. The only, love children will be good shepherds of this world.
that's true.
And unloved children, children who have in some ways been traumatized in the womb, because perhaps their mother or father were drinking too much or taking too many recreational drugs, or any of those things can be incredibly um, bad for the unborn child, physically and psychologically. They will not be born the way they were supposed to. So if they are not traumatized, if they are loved, instead of that, if the mother and father take care of their children right from conception on, then we can have a chance at a better world, because children who are loved will be peaceful, and
Yes.
children who are violated will violate the environment.
Yes. Well, thank you, Thomas. Thank you for your time today, and thank you for giving this interview.
Thank you, Kate, and good luck to you in all that you do and all the important work that you do.
Thank you.